This meeting is being recorded.
All right, there we are. So, good evening, my friends. We find ourselves on Lamed Tes Amud Beis, 39b, three lines down from the top. So, it should still be the first section in Art Scroll. Previously on our Gemara Shir, it's good for us just to remember the Mishnah that was on the previous Amud. And I don't think we met for 2 weeks, it was because of the Yomim Tovim, but God willing, we are now back on track. So a refresher is definitely in order. We learned in the Mishnah on Lamed Tesam and Aleph that if someone is purchasing Arba Minim during the Shemitah year, for the Esrog in particular, we're worried about Shemitah, that's Kedusha Shvias, the sanctity of the seventh year. And if you are purchasing it from an Am Haaretz, someone who is presumed not to be knowledgeable and careful with the laws of Shemitah, according to Tosfos, the concern is he won't use it for the purpose of eating or the limited purposes it could be used for during Shemitah. According to Rashi, the concern was that he would not dispose of it when it's supposed to be destroyed. Once that kind of plant no longer exists in the wild, in the field, you're supposed to remove it from your house and destroy it. So we're afraid Amaretz will not be scrupulous and will not be careful about taking care of that. So therefore, the Gemara limited that you could only purchase potentially Shemitah food from him for up to 3 sudas, basically enough money that he'd be able to reasonably spend it almost immediately and then consume the food, and that therefore we don't have any Shemitah concerns. However, an esrog, as you might know, well, maybe with inflation, I'm not sure how this works out, but an esrog can cost more than you could get for 3 meals. I don't know if that works today. So then the question is, how do you go about it? So we said actually one of the suggestions in the Gemara was that you can subsume the esrog within the purchase of the lulav. Meaning, if the lulav, I'm just throwing out numbers over here, would cost on its own $10, now you'll pay $70, right? And then the esrog will be given to you as a matana. So right, that's a gimmick that happens at stores all the time. Buy one, get one free, but then they basically hike up the price of the item, so you're essentially paying for 2 items anyway. And that's basically what was suggested. And so we're on Lamites on the base now, 39b from the three lines from the top, and we lead off, of course, with the question. Masiv Rav Sheshas. Rav Sheshas, oh, sorry, there's one more thing from the Gemara that we need to know just before going in. All of that, what we learned is under the assumption that the esrog was not being fenced off. Your fields are supposed to be open to the public during Shemitah. They're hefker. So if it was meshumar, if it was guarded and locked up, then you're not allowed to purchase from him no matter what the price is. We don't patronize them. And at the end of our Gemara tonight, we will, if I forget, remind me, I have it right next to me. We'll be looking at the Rishimo Shirim. These are Rav Soloveitchik's Shirim on Masechta, and he has an excellent insight into Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam basically says that any food that is guarded during the Shemitah year, in his words, he says the peiros, well, what Tosas tells us Rabbi Tam said, I don't have the Sefer HaYashar with me, the peiros min hamashumar asuren. It sounds like they are forbidden to be consumed. So more on that at the end of this year. So here we go. Maser Rav Sheshes umin hamufkar gimel sudos besulo. Is it true that you could only pay him up to the worth of 3 meals and no more than that? Or a minhi, but it seems to be contradicted, and the citation is from Shvius Parak Tes Mishnah Aleph, in case you are curious. Or a minhi, hapigim faribozin, v'ashitim v'chal glogos, v'kusbar shebaharim, v'karpa shebenaharos, v'garga shel afar, peturim min hamaiser. This whole cacophony of things that I don't really exactly know what they are. I'm sure, I mean, Rashi tries to go through it, and then He even gives some French, which is always helpful. And I'm sure Art School gives you some rendering as well. Basically, the point is all these different things are exempt from Meiser, v'nikach mikol adam b'shvius. And they could also be purchased from anyone during Shvius. Why? Lefi she'ein kayotze behen nishmarhu. Because these kind of things just don't get guarded. So you don't have to worry that they are not being kept under the right conditions during Shemitah. But the question here is that, okay, we know they're not Meshumar, we know they're not being fenced off from the public, but even if they're not fenced off, if you're purchasing from an Am Haaretz, you're still only allowed to pay up to the worth of 3 meals. So why here is there a carte blanche? So Mosiv Lav Humafarikla. He asked the question and he gave the answer to the question. B'chdei manshanu. So you basically have to make what's called a new kimta. We do this all the time. You have to read between the lines. Yeah, implicitly what that meant was that, yes, with the self-understood limit of up to 3 meals. And this is, and Rav Barachana, the name of Rav Yochanan, concurs with this circumscription. Briefly, before we conclude the first section of Gemara, who says that the word mun is from the language of mizonos, and we have a great pasuk, but well, actually, vayaman lehen hamelech, which actually is from Daniel, and I'm sure you're all asking why are we not talking about mun from the Torah, right? Which is a question that occurred to me, at least. If you look at Rashi, B'chdei mizonosav shana dinikachim v'yishalosh sudos, and in Rashi v'yamalan hamelech it's sarchei suda mishtay kra b'Daniel v'yaman hamelech yifarsim. So the idea is the reason it didn't use the term mun from the Torah is because in Daniel it's more explicitly talking about a suda. It's talking about an actual meal that you have, not just mun that you whether you cooked it or whatever, but basically it didn't have the connotation of a meal. So I think that's it seems to be from Rashi. That's why it gave preferential treatment to a pasuk in Daniel over a pasuk in the Torah itself, which seems more explicit. All right, very good. That is the first section of Gemara. Relatively nothing new in terms of key terms or key concepts. But now we're going to actually learn something new, and this is a I remember when I learned Sukkah back in high school, like this one started making my head spin. But it's just keeping the pshat in the Gemara without getting too involved in the Tostos. It's rather straightforward enough. So here's the question: only fruits of the 7th year have kedushas shvias, right? You're with me on that? Nothing new, straightforward. But the question is, how do we determine whether something is a 7th year fruit or a 6th year fruit? So certain things like fruits are so basically there's 2 ways to determine it. One is either basar chanata, which is even within this is a little bit of discussion to Rishon how to define it. But basically, once the fruit reaches a certain threshold in its growth, either begins to sprout or it's like I think a third complete. So once it basically hits a certain threshold, it's already considered good to go. And if it reaches that threshold during the 6th year, despite the fact that you will reap it during the 7th year, it is still classified as a 6th year fruit. Whereas the other way to look at it, certain things are based on Lakita, are based on not when they begin to blossom, begin to grow, when they reach a threshold, but rather it's based on when they are picked from their stalk or whatever you want to call it. That's the moment that we classify. So if it's picked during the 7th year, even if it had its main growth in the 6th year, it is now has Kedushas Shvias. So the question is, an esrog, shares qualities that are similar to fruits, which I think is more obvious, and it shares qualities in a sense that's more similar to vegetables. And you'll see what I mean in just a moment. And this is going to create some confusion about how do we classify esrogim. So let's see the Gemara. The Gemara says, wait a minute, we've been focusing on esrogim this whole time. Ihachi luv nami. this whole issue about purchasing an esrog with kedusha shvius from an am haaretz, shouldn't this concern equally apply to lulavim of the seventh year? And then here in the Gemara seems in principle at least to be on board with that, but just gives almost a technical answer. Lulav bar shishis hanichnas l'shviyasu. Yeah, but the lulav that we're talking about here, it grew during the 6th year, and so it is a 6-year lulav, which doesn't have kedusha shviyas. Otherwise, it would be subject to the concerns we listed above. Ihachi. Okay, well, if we don't have to worry about the lulavim, esrog nami bas shishis hanichnas l'shviyasi, then presumably the esrog also was from the 6th year that entered the 7th year. So why are we getting all up in arms about the esroge shmita, and we're not worried about the lulave shmita as well? So here comes the point that we introduced. Esrog basar likita azlinan. For an esrog, it's based on when it is picked from its tree. So now let's take a look at Rashi for a moment. Rashi explains what the logic of this is. So if you look at esrog basar likita azlinan, it's about roughly maybe 8 lines, 9 lines up from the bottom of Rashi. Esrog basar likita azlinan. T'chalak mishar ilanos. It's not exactly like every other tree. The dino kiyarak, and an actual kiyarak, it's actually like a vegetable. Shaholchubo basar lakita. So fruit trees go based on chanata when they reach that threshold of growth, and vegetables generally go based on when they are picked. Why? What's the fundamental difference between a fruit tree versus vegetables? Mishum degado al kol mayim. Kamriya Rosh Hashanah, basically it requires not just megishamim, not just water from the rain, but you also have to provide your own water as well. You need irrigation. You need to go over there and pour some water on it. So it can't rely on the rain alone. So that's the difference between a vegetable versus the fruit tree. So the esrog, even though it has all the trappings and all the characteristics of a fruit, if you're going to, for instance, right, you go into Haraya, you go into Grade A, you go into Stop and Shop. They don't have a esrogim there, admittedly, but if there were to be an esrog there, which section would it be in? It would probably be with the fruit, not in the vegetable section. It would probably be, next to the other citrus fruits. So, but since it has a certain quality in terms of how you grow it with water, therefore, in certain ways, it is like a vegetable. So therefore, it's based on the Lakita, based on when it is picked. However, the Gemara asks, and this takes a few lines to get through the question. Bein Rabbi Gamliel, Bein Rabbi Eliezer, Linyan Shvias Esrog Basar Chanatas Linan. But both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Gamliel are in agreement that when it comes to Shvias, actually, no, an Esrog is based on when it reaches that threshold of growth. It's none. Esrog shavel ilan begimel drachim. An esrog it's a Mishnah. An esrog is similar to a tree in 3 ways. Liyarg b'derech echad, and then to a vegetable in 1 way. Shavet. So shavel ilan begimel drachim. In what ways is it similar to a tree? Arla, l'revai, l'shvius. So arla, l'revai, they kind of go together. This idea that you leave the fruit tree on its own for the first 3 years, and then the 4th year is revai, as the name suggests. And then there is Shvius, which we've been talking about, the sabbatical year. Yarg b'derech echad, and has a similar to a vegetable. Shebeshas likitaso isuro, that when it is picked, that is when it is classified for Meiser purposes. And Divrei Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer Omer esrog shavli in lechol davarhu. Now, actually, an esrog is similar to a fruit in every way possible. So either way you slice it, though, their machlokis only pertains to Meiser. When it comes to Shvius, both are in agreement that it is classified as a fruit. It should be classified based on the chanata, based on when it reaches its threshold, initial threshold of growth. Therefore, it should be no different than the lulav, and therefore we're back to square one. Why is it that we're worried about esroge shmita, but we're not worried about the lulave shmita? So the answer is Our guy just doesn't hold by them. Simple as that. The Amar ki hai tana to Tanya Amar of Yossi avatulumos heid mishum chamisha zakenim. He testified in the name of five elders. Esrog acher lekita lemeiser. Initially, they said in Esrog is basic is for meiser purposes is based on when it is reaped. But v'raboseinu nimnu be'usha. There's a bunch of things that they decided on in Usha over there. I think we get a reference to Rosh Hashanah there. V'amru bein lemeiser bein leshvias. Nope. Whether it be meiser, whether it be shvias, the esrog is based on the time that it is picked. So again, back to our scenario. Even though both the esrog and lulav already had begun to blossom and to grow during the 6th year, since they were both picked during the shvias year, Shemitah, the lulav is already considered 6th year because it was basar chanata. But for the esrog, it's basar lekita, and that's why we have to worry about the esrog. We'll go just a little bit further. The Gemara asks, Shvias mad dekar shemei. Wait a minute. If you just read the Shach V'Tarya, it sounds like it's responding to a question, trying to clarify the stance on Shvias. But no one brought up Shvias. So basically, here's how you have to read it. Here's how to read basically the conversation. Initially, they said Esrog achar lekita lemeiser v'achar chanata l'shvias. And Esrog goes based on the time it is read for meiser, but it goes based on its chanata when it grows for shvias. The rabbis say in Usha, but then our rabbis got together and they decided in Usha. The Amru Esrog basar lekita bein lemeiser bein l'shvias. Then an esrog goes based on the time that it is reaped, whether for meiser, whether for shvias. The end. Okay. Now, I promised you a piece from Rav Soloveitchik, did I not? Okay, very good. So we are not going to go through the entire massive Tosos on the right side of the Amud. But if you look at the beginning of it, or honestly, it might take you a while to find the precise line I'm referencing, so you can just even listen. Tosos initially cites Rashi. Right? So basically, remember we talked about right at the beginning that you can pay the Am Haaretz who are not sure if he keeps Shemitah up till 3 meals worth of money. But if we see he has a fence up and it's locked and no one can access his field, then you're not allowed to buy any Shemitah products off of him. Why is that? So Rabbeinu Tam is cited in Tosos as saying the peiros min hameshumar asurin. The peiros that are guarded, that are kept from the public, are usur. Now, bringing in Rav Soloveitchik, there's 2 ways to understand this statement. One way to understand is that there is inherently an isur achila. The same way you can't eat pork, the same way you cannot eat the Shemitah food that is being guarded right now. There's inherently an Isser Achila on that. But he says, and I'll read for you some of it, Mistaber Shein Isser Hamashumar Aliva to Rabbeinu Tam, Chalos Isser Achila K'macholos Asuros. However, if you look at his proof text, it doesn't really sound like it's inherently an Isser Achila. Ella shekayim b'meshumar iser shalchil kedushas peiros shvius shaloch mitzvasam. Rather, the prohibition, it's a little bit more nuanced, is that you are not treating peiros shvius the way that we are commanded to treat them. What does that mean? So let me read for you just another excerpt. Im habal hifkiras hapeiros v'kayim b'mis mitzvas tishmatena unatashta. Remember, we talked about how it's not just simply, depending how you understand it, one understanding is that Hashem automatically renders all the fields Kedusha Shvias, whether you want to make it Hefker or not. The other way to understand it, we saw in the Minchas Chinuch, is that no, there's a mitzvah coming upon the owner to declare his field Hefker. If he doesn't do it, it's not Hefker. You're not allowed to go in there. But then he's also transgressing the Torah by neglecting a dereliction of his responsibility to free his field. So let's say you have that owner who opts and says, I'm not interested in keeping the Torah this year, I'm keeping my field. So kiyum hahefker mekachim lachila k'mitzvasam. When you do free it, the act of declaring your field hefker is using the Shemitah food in the way that you are commanded. Ulam, Harris Mishumar. However, when you guard your fruit and you do not permit it to the public, the das or tam omdim isuram, they just remain in their initial state of isser. Meaning, in order for you to eat your Shemitah food, you have to first declare it hefker in order so it is considered consumable at that point. Kiniskachi bechalos kedusha shvias, because until now they have the status of shvius, kishagadlu mibli sheikdusha achila, but they didn't come with the permission to eat it. Ali hefker habal commits shvius, and when he classifies this, he says someone who eats this is in violation of the iser koloi peiros shvius shalok mitzvasim. Right? Remember how we talked about how you're supposed to eat your shvius food, right? But you're not supposed to have a food fight. You're not supposed to do that in general with food. But you're not supposed to have a food fight with your Shemitah. There's certain ways that you're supposed to use Shemitah products. I think anointing could be one of them. It depends on the product, but for eating and for very circumscribed uses. So until you declare your food hefker, it is absolutely circumscribed. It's not that you are not allowed to eat it, it's that you're not using the Shemitah food as it is intended. And until you free it, it has no intended purpose. Now, I know this sounds very abstract and convoluted, or maybe just the way I'm explaining it, but Rasav Aging does us a favor. If you have a chakir, if you have a dichotomy, you need a good litmus test to show us, who cares how I understand why I can't eat it? Well, here's a nafkamina. So he says as follows. Benir sheyesh kan nafkamina benogea le'esrog ha'mashumer b'shvi. So here's our nafkamina. In chal al ha'esrog chalos shem isra achila. Here's the question. The most obvious nafkamina. Can I use it to fulfill the mitzvah of dalid minim? If I take an esrog from a field that is mashumar, our Gemara is just worried about paying an am haaretz. Let's say I am that am haaretz. Or I'm not, whatever. Let's say I guard my field. My Yitzhar gets the better of me. But my Yitzhar Tov says, hey, just because you did one Avir doesn't mean you can't do a mitzvah. So I'm going to go ahead and fulfill Arba Minim. And I take an esrog out of my guarded field. Have I fulfilled the mitzvah of Dalid Minim, of Lulav and esrog? So it depends how we understand the prohibition of consuming the guarded Shemitah food. If it is inherently classified as an iser achila, ha'esrog pasulhu l'netila came boheter achila. We mentioned in the Gemara in the past that in order for you to be yotze with the esrog, it has to be consumable. Not that you're actually going to take a bite out of it, but it has to be edible. It has to be ra'oi. It has to be capable of being consumed. So here, if it's inherently an isra achila, if that's how we understand it, that there's an classified as a prohibition to eat the food, then the esrog is disqualified. But if the prohibition doesn't stem from an explicit prohibition of consumption, but rather it's just a more generalized prohibition of not using Shemitah food in accordance with the proper usages. He says it's no worse than using an esrog of avodah zara. We mentioned that an esrog of avodah zara, assuming it doesn't have to actually be grinded down to dust, even though there's an isser hana, even though you're not supposed to benefit from it, we say mitzvos lavle hanos nitnu, that a mitzvah act is not called gratification. So there's your nafkamina. If it's an explicit prohibition of eating, you can't use it as an esrog in the dalaminim, but if it's just a generalized issue of not using the food as you are permitted to, as you're supposed to, then it could be used, even if you are still doing the avera of withholding it from the public. But if you do declare it hefker, then all of a sudden you have more options of what you're allowed to do with that food. But it's still all within the purview, the framework of asking the question, what can I do with the Shemitah food? And the Torah has circumscribed uses for it. All right, so we got a little bit of an Achronin over there, and Tosos as well. All righty. Paul, do you have was that something or oh, you're muted, but I thought you were going to
No,
say.
no, I think I had a question, but I'm not sure. So there is some produce that the determining fact date is when it ripens. So if it ripens in the seventh year,
Oh,
but it's picked
yeah.
in the eighth year, for lack of a better number, the eighth year, does it still have to be treated as hefker? What, you're no longer in the Shemitah year. What does the farmer do at that point?
So I think that's what it depends on. If it's based on Chanata, yeah. So yeah, it just depends which year it reaches that threshold. I think the same logic works on the other end as well. I would think so. All right. Very good, everyone. Well, glad to be back to it. And I'll be giving the 10:30 shir to Shabbos. I realized I didn't tell everyone I've been doing a lot of Igros Moshe during the 10:30 shir. So if anyone's like been hearing me talk about the Igros Moshe shir and you weren't sure when it was taking place, it's basically every 2 to 3 weeks I wind up covering the 10:30, which is wonderful. So this Shabbos, we're doing part two of dishwashers, ovens, and sinks. I'll give a very brief review at the beginning for those who weren't there on part one. And in part two, we'll talk about some of the final halachos and then some of the hashkafa about affluence and halacha that emerges from there. And then the next class we'll do after that will be, I think I entitled it Mikvah, Money, and Mysticism. So that's an exciting one that whenever I get a good alliteration, I'm happy. All right.
Rabbi, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Rabbi, yeah, I probably missed it. I'm sorry. I apologize. What's the difference between Shvi'it and Shemitah?
I mean, Shvius is the seventh year, and then
Yeah.
Shemitah is the kind of like the status of Shemitah. You know, talk about Shemitah's Ksafim, for instance, how the money no longer is within your possession.
Well,
Shemitah's Karka. So I
I
mean,
was thinking about.
you get used interchangeably.
Well, isn't Shemitah the seventh year that you don't eat the fruit?
Yes,
Isn't that
Shemitah
Shvi'it?
takes
So
place
what's the
during
difference?
Shvius, which is the seventh year.
Oh, so
I've
they're
been using them
interchangeable
interchangeably.
words? Oh, okay.
But
Thank you.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Glad we could clarify that. All right,
Thank
wishing you all a wonderful Shabbos. Looking
Thank you.
forward to
You
seeing you,
too.
God willing.